Good afternoon. This afternoon, we're going to combine two subjects together because we've fallen behind in topics we're going to try and cover. And so we're going to go back to looking at fascism, but fascism everywhere, not just in the United States. We had a famous novelist, Sinclair Lewis, who once warned us, it can't happen here, but it did. And it happened in Louisiana in the time of FDR. He had to put up with a really terrible person down in Baton Rouge. That person was Huey Long. And if there ever was an American fascist, it was Huey Long. He is the subject of a very famous book, All the King's Men, which was written actually by a Berkeley student from faraway California. And the film that was made, All the King's Men, won an Oscar for Broderick Crawford, who played the role of Huey Long. It's been filmed twice, not very well the second time by Sean Penn, but the first time it was a great movie and was a look at the dark side, the side of fascism. Franklin Roosevelt did all he could to abolish the influence of fascism in this country, but it came about in several ways. I don't know if you really know very much about various things that went on in this country in the 1930s or even later, because fascism was always fashionable. It appealed to very wealthy people, even people who live in Florida today. I won't mention the name. And so the problem was what to do and how to operate. And people like Father Conklin also fed the terrible thing that was fascism in America. And even up until the 1960s, maybe you don't know this, I'm a Roman Catholic, and there is a very famous Roman Catholic cardinal. His name was Spellman. He was the Cardinal Primate of New York. And you might be surprised to know that Spellman rode in an open car with Richard Nixon when Nixon was running for president against John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Now, this would seem strange to you, I know, knowing that Mr. Kennedy was the first Catholic candidate and the leading Roman Catholic cardinal was riding with the opposition, but he was, and he did. On their side, the Kennedys, who had always had friends with high-ranking Catholics, had in the form of Cardinal Cushing, who was primate of Boston, a great successor cardinal to others, and it was Spellman who tripped up the lineup of Catholics because he favored Nixon, even though the Catholic candidate was the Democratic John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Cushing ran a lot of things on the side for the Kennedys. You might not have known it, but John Fitzgerald Kennedy was an Irishman who really liked women. And he'd actually been married before Jackie Bouvier Kennedy, later Onassis. And before Jackie, he was married down in Florida when he was a young man and in the Navy. And Cushing got it so that that marriage was annulled. That's a way Catholics have in some areas of getting a divorce, because divorce is forbidden. But if somehow you can make a case that it was not a legal marriage and wasn't consummated, then you can get a dispensation by having the marriage annulled. So enough on that kind of politics. There were people in our country who were fascists. There are still people who are fascists. Fascism has always been fashionable. That is, people with a lot of money find it very attractive to have a political party that serves their needs. Now, that was going on in our country, but simultaneously, it also had spread to Europe. And the first fascist government to make any difference at all was Mussolini, Benito Mussolini, in Italy. And it was Mussolini who set up policy. And so the first attacks on Jews were not in Germany, they were in Italy. Ignazio Saloni, in a very famous book, Italian book, explains this, and so does Vittorio De Sica in a great film. The film is The Garden of the Pizzicontini. Pizzicontini were a very famous Jewish family in Italy, and they were destroyed by the Italian fascists. Even in Rome itself, with a Roman Pope, whose cardinal name was Pacelli, but who actually came to the throne of St. Peter as a very, very well-known Vatican specialist. Pacelli was his pre-papal name. He was known as Pius XII. And Pius was also, before he was Pope, he was papal nuncio to Germany. And in his view, the biggest threat to Roman Catholics and all Christians was communism, where the various dogmas that had been espoused suggested that religion is the opium of the people. So Pacelli favored any government that came to power that was anti-communist. Now, he had a friend who was a papal head of Venice. He was a very jolly, round and about fat, basically, Cardinal of Venice. And he came to the papal throne later as John XXII, who gave us Vatican II and all the reforms. I don't know if you know it, but the old Roman Church used to say everything in Latin. So when I was an altar boy, or when I went to St. Mary's School, we had 4 years of Latin, perfectly worthless language, other than the fact you could read the classics, like Caesar's Gallic War, Gallia est divisa in tres partes, but you couldn't do much wealth with it. And so fascism grew into a very big cancer when it finally spread to Deutschland. And its spread there was peculiar. We're going to have a movie soon, in fact, this week. The movie has to do with Weimar Germany. Germany in the 20s, after they lost World War I, had a communist government that lasted only a couple of months in Berlin. The army put it down. And then you had the Jazz Age. And it was jazzy in Berlin as it was in Paris. The problem was how to keep this combined with a growing Germany. And what did go wrong was the fact that we think that the only ones who ever had a Great Depression and then elected Franklin Roosevelt was us. But in fact, it was a worldwide depression, and it completely destroyed the German economy. So here is Germany without the Nazis. All Germans, it's important to remember, are not Nazis, never were, never would be. And they have this crushing depression. So while people on Wall Street might have been jumping out of the 20th floor of a building, people in Germany were lining up, and it took a wheelbarrow full of Deutschmarks to buy a loaf of bread. So things were very desperate. And Hitler had already tried a beer hall push, attempt to take over, and he had failed miserably. So the Germans were not ready for him yet, but by the time the Depression came and hit them very badly, they did become fascists of the first water. So it's hard to explain to you except through stories that I'm going to tell you. I have taken many, many trips to Germany, to Eastern Europe, and I've always enjoyed them. And I took one of the very first that Berkeley organized. It was an alumni trip, and it was going to go to Berlin, and then we were going to Eastern Europe. We were going to cross the Frankfurt on Oder, not Frankfurt on Main, but on the Oder River on the other side, and then cross northern Poland, stopping at the old dacha that had belonged to Chopin, then going into Warsaw, and then going south and coming all the way around through Budapest, Buda and Pest, and then Vienna, and then Prague, and then home. So what happens? Well, we get going. I get to go to Chopin's home outside of Warsaw. I get actually to play the piano, Chopin's own piano. I think I played a piece of music by Beethoven, but it was the idea of playing on the piano that Chopin had created great music on. And then we came into Warsaw. Now, Warsaw was very much destroyed in World War II and had been rebuilt. And we went to a central area in Warsaw where there had been the Warsaw Ghetto, a horrible story in German, Polish history, and the chancellor, Willy Brandt, he had come to say amen, to swear that Germany would never again try and conquer Poland, and had kneeled down and said a prayer at the site of the Warsaw Ghetto. So I was contained enough, so I went in and said also a prayer there with my group. And then we went on. We were going south. We go to a very holy place where there is the Black Virgin of Czestochowa. Black refers to the nature of the aging of the resin on her painting, her and her wooden carved and painted image. And then we left there and we went down to my favorite place, Warsaw in the north and Krakow in the south, are connected by a great Polish river. This river, the Vistula, cuts Poland in half. And all the way in the north is the area of Gdansk, which in the olden days had been another town at another time. But now it was Gdansk, and it was Polish again. And we stopped there. And then we went down the Vistula to Czestochowa, and then to my favorite city. It's called Krakow. Krakow has in it probably the most beautiful Italian woman that's ever lived. She is a Leonardo da Vinci, the girl with a veil. She was a 16-year-old girl who da Vinci had painted. She was the mistress of a man who was the Duke of Milan, the Sforza Duke. And he had painted her. It was a very celebrated painting. And then somehow it was lost. She, as a painting, disappeared. But in fact, she'd been bought. She had been bought. And she had been brought to Poland by a prince from Krakow. And I knew that I would get to see her. So I thought, wonderful, wunderbar. At last, I'll see the original. And I did. And I have a very, very wonderful copy of it, framed, hanging outside my apartment. So if you're going to see it yourself, you come to the 15th floor in the other building, and there she will be. Now, all that was very wonderful. Krakow was wonderful. It's a walled city. They had wonderful old music there. And Then the trouble started. A couple from Los Angeles, they were Jewish. They came to me privately and they said, we have a couple of days here and we'd like for you to lead us to Auschwitz. Auschwitz is around an hour's drive by motor car from Krakow. And I said, I don't know Auschwitz, and I don't think you would enjoy it. And they said, oh, yes, we want to see it very badly. And we have already interviewed everyone on the motor coach, and they all want to go also. So I was stuck. Here I was with a group of people who wanted to not see a Leonardo da Vinci so much, but as to see this awful death camp. It's an industrial death camp. It's just like a factory. It had its own railroad station. So I took a deep breath and I said, well, I'll call the office back in Berkeley. Well, I did, and the Berkeley people said, absolutely no, we're not having a Cal trip to Auschwitz. And I said, well, you know, the people all want to go, and if I don't take them, they'll try and hire a motor coach on their own. So Berkeley called me back and said, these are the conditions. We advise you not to do it. But if you do it, the people must pay the salary of the driver, must pay for the rental of the motor coach that day, must arrange their own meals. Nothing will be included and no money will be returned. So I called the group together and said, this is the deal. And they said, it's a great deal. Let's take it. We'll go. Well, my friends, I grew up in a very small town in Virginia. And while we don't have any Jews in that town, we certainly have never had a death camp in that town. But we went. The next morning, we all got on the motor coach very quietly, and we drove to the death camp. So fascism can happen anywhere, and it has happened already in Europe. We arrived at the death camp, and I'm telling you the story because the New York Times this week, they had a picture of the first Soviet soldier who had ever entered Auschwitz. Auschwitz was captured by the Red Army in their push to destroy the Third Reich. So it bothered me to think about this era all over again. So we got close to the camp. There's its own parking lot, its own train station. It is unbelievable. It is an industrial death camp. We got out of the motor coach. People are rather quiet. Everything is just as it was the day the camp was liberated. Nothing has been changed. The Soviet Union used this as an example of what happens if you live in capitalism. And they say so in large letters on the fence in French, German, English, Russian, and I think Spanish, to make sure the message is clear that this is what capitalism does to a people. Well, I took a deep breath. I stood with all the people there. I didn't know what to do. I bought the tickets. They sell tickets. And I said, I don't know what to do now. They said, you go into this modern theater that's been built inside the camp. So that was our first mistake. We went into the theater, and the Soviets had made a film as they approached the camp, as they got to the camp, as they went into the camp. They filmed everything. The walking dead that could still get up to the camera and beg for food. The children who were emaciated. And so we sat in the theater seats and we watched the camp being liberated, step by awful step. When the hour film was over, we were devastated, and it had just begun. We went out of the theater, and then we walked a goodly distance. We came to barracks. You opened the door and went in the barracks, and what was it full of? It was full of human hair. They'd take all the hair they could from the Jews and used it to stuff mattresses. We went to another barracks. It was full of eyeglasses. They had taken all the glasses away from the Jews. And so it went, barracks by barracks by barracks. And that wasn't even the worst. We got to the area that the I.G. Farben people had worked on, and there were the crematoria. And it was unbelievable. Of course, they had all been cremated, many of them alive. They've been told they were going to take showers, apparently taken off their clothes, and then the doors were closed and locked, and the gas was released. I'm told you could hear the screaming. And when the screaming died, it meant they were dead. And then you were taken to the ovens. Well, we finally got out of there, barracks after barracks, crematoria after crematoria. And it was now almost night. So we got back on the motor coach. It started to rain, just a light shower. And we drove back to the hotel. We got out of the motor coach, went into the hotel, went to our rooms, closed the door and turned off the lights. I'll never forget one woman from LA who said to me, "There's a piece of jewelry downtown. I want to buy it, so I'm going to run down and get it." I was flabbergasted. Turned out she was the other person who was Jewish from Los Angeles. But the people who had asked me to take them there, the very nice Jewish couple I'd met, they went with me upstairs to their room and locked the door. We were all right the next morning. We had some coffee and a Danish or some sort. The town had lost all of its interest. I had finally seen the Leonardo da Vinci. She traveled all over the world. She's actually been to San Francisco to see us. She traveled all over Europe during the wars. For one time, she was actually in the bedroom hanging of the Nazi head of the Polish government during World War II. So we got on the motor coach and we went down the Vistula, across the mountains, down into the Danube plain to Budapest. And we never thought anymore out loud about what we'd seen at Auschwitz. I think it'd be very hard for anyone, Jew or non-Jew, Catholic or non-Catholic, Protestant, Buddhist, and we went through Buddha and Pesh. They were interesting things. Coffee was first introduced by the Turks in Budapest. When the Austrians came in and reconquered what had been a Turkish outpost for 100 years, the Austrians said, "What in the heck are these huge bags of beans? We see them all over the place." And there was a big hotel there that I was staying in, the Galatea, which had a hot spring, so you could take a wonderful hot, steamy bath. And the people in Hungarians in Budapest said, "Well, we don't know what the hell they were. They were some kind of bean, and every day a Turk would come in and take a handful out and crush the beans and then pour hot water over the beans and then drink this dark liquid that they got from the bean." And so coffee was born in the Danube River Basin. It's one of the reasons that Vienna is one of the greatest places in the world to have a Kaffee mit Schlag, a coffee with lots of whipped cream, and it is good. There's a place in Vienna that I know well. You can go and get a Kuchen, a piece of wonderful cake to go with your coffee. But that's from a different time and a different place. Anyway, I went with my group, took them to the places they should see. The Vienna Staatsoper on the Opera Ring, the house where Freud had operated on his patients, the wonderful place where the Empress had entertained, the Hofburg, the palace, and the palace outside of Vienna, which was a copy of Versailles. So you can imagine how huge a complex it was. And then we got all the way back to Berlin. I remember then what Hannah Arendt had said to me years ago when she was teaching at Berkeley. Hannah Arendt, if you don't know it, is a very famous Jewish woman. And she said, "You know, it took Hitler to make me know I was a Jew. We were so assimilated as a people. We were so part of the whole. And yet she herself had become the lover of her professor, who was a major defender of the Nazi cause. Fascism was always fashionable." So much for Hannah Arendt. She very funny today as a Jewish woman. There's a little alley in Berlin named for her. And it goes right past the underground bunker where Herr Hitler committed suicide. And I always show it to my friends when I take them to Berlin, but we have to be very careful. The German Polizei watch very carefully that no one is having a celebration in Hitler's name at the bunker where he committed suicide. So I prep my people that we will walk very slowly. We will take no pictures. We will do nothing to bring any sense. We will not have the Cal banner, blue and gold with letters Cal all over it, right next to the bunker. The bunker is underground, you can't see it. But when initially you could go in and you could take things. You could take a sterling silver cup or even a spoon with a Nazi insignia on it. All that's gone now, there's just green grass. But people know where it's underneath that green grass. and you watch very carefully, you do not get the attention of the Polizei. German police can be rather forceful. And so we went home, and many years went by. I was doing other things. Then I have a very good friend, Wolfgang Schluchter, who's the Max Weber Professor of Sociology at Heidelberg. Heidelberg, where a large number of Hitler's cronies graduated. And Wolfgang said to me, come over, because I have been invited to go into several East European universities, German, now that we are reunited as a people. And unfortunately, the East German universities had hired untalented people. If you were someone's son or someone's daughter, you could get a tenured position. And so they had been asked by Germany is a lot of powerful Länder, states, like Saxony is a state, Hesse is a state, Baden is a state, Württemberg is a state, Bavaria is a state, and in the north is Brandenburg and the rest. So each state was cleaning house if they had a group of people there. So I went. I thought, this is really interesting. I'll get to see people I don't know and see how they're doing this operation. Because if you don't know anything about the Germans, I will tell you this, they're very thorough. So we were going about our business, and I said, this is a very wonderful town. It's the town that the greatest amount of reform came to Germany from. It's Weimar. What is that ugly, ugly series of buildings up on the hill? And Brigitte and Wolfgang both looked at me as if I were crazy. And they said, don't you know, that's the death camp at Buchenwald. So here I was again, trapped in a death camp. But I insisted I go. They didn't want to go. So I went alone. What was interesting in Buchenwald was the same horrible story, but they had killed a lot of British pilots they had captured. Britain, before we were in the war, and certainly during the time we were in the war, had lost a lot of pilots in the bombing raids over Berlin, Hamburg, Hanover, Dortmund, et cetera, et cetera. And they had bailed out, of course. That's what you do when you're shot down. You try and get the hell out of the airplane. And they had been captured and they'd been turned in, not as POWs, but as candidates for extermination because they had dared to hit back at Hitler's Reich. In the meantime, there's a wonderful woman. She's not alive now. Vida Sackville-West. She's a great British woman, married to a very famous husband, very modern marriage. She was the lover of Virginia Woolf, and he had his love affairs. He was the ambassador in Persia and Iran before the war. And when he was home, they used to sit out in the most gorgeous garden you've ever seen in your life, the famous white garden at Sissinghurst. Sissinghurst was the home of Vida Sackville-West. And sitting out there in the daytime, they would see a dogfight between two fighter planes, one a German Messerschmitt 109 and another one a British fighter. And the German fighter would be shot down. The Messerschmitt had a great failing as an aircraft. It had very limited time over target and it had to get back to refuel. So they were losing a lot of them. And the parachute would open and there would become the German pilot floating down, down, down. And then he's arrested by nice old British guy. And he's put into a POW camp. And he stays there alive to the rest of the war. So here were the British treating the Germans like human beings, and there were the Germans. And there were Germans who knew that and who felt disgraced by the breaking of the rules of war about how you treat prisoners of war. But in Hitler's Germany, it didn't seem to matter. So we have Buchenwald side by side with the great German arts. You have no idea how wonderful Weimar was. It was the center of German art, German opera composers, German painters, German writers, those who hadn't escaped. You understand that many Germans saw the handwriting on the wall and they left. Thomas Mann, the greatest German novelist, came to the United States. Marlene Dietrich came to the United States. Billy Wilder, film director, came to the United States. Over and over again, you can list Kurt Weill and the woman who sang for him, Lotta Linja. All these people came to escape Hitler. They came to the United States for safe haven. And they paid it back by, they all became Americans. They never wanted to go back. And when they did go back, it was to unoccupied Europe. And beautiful women like Dietrich couldn't stand the idea she was getting not so beautiful, so she became a recluse. And then when she died, she had her funeral mass or ceremony in the Church of the Madeleine in Paris, and then her body was shipped home to Germany. The Germans then disliked her tremendously because they thought she was a traitor, but she is buried in Berlin, not far from all the other places. I'll tell you another story. In its day, Berlin had the 1936 Olympics. This is before the war. And Berlin was all set up, be very celebrated, win lots of awards. Leni Riefenstahl made a very famous film, several. One, Triumph of the Will, is a very difficult film, but the other was Olympiad. She filmed the Olympics. And surprisingly, very much to the displeasure of the Fuhrer, Jesse Owens won. You don't know who Jesse Owens was, let me tell you. He was an African American and proud of it. And he won a gold medal. Hitler refused to recognize it. But if you go to that area, I go to Berlin a lot, and you go to where the Stadium is, there's a very special little alley. And you look up to see the name, and it's Jesse Owens Strasse. But there are other famous Strasses in Berlin. There's the famous Marlene Dietrich Strasse. And there's the Anna Arendt Strasse. How angry this would have made Herr Hitler, the coward that he was. So I had done Buchenwald. I had done the great death camp itself, Auschwitz. I was finished with these death camps. I'd accidentally done a death camp in Germany because there aren't many there. And this one was between Stuttgart, where I lived, and Munich, where I spent a lot of time. And there wasn't anything left of it. The West Germans were too embarrassed to keep any of it, just a sign. And I thought my career with death camps were over. And then, God Almighty, I was asked to lead a tour for Cal Berkeley of the Czech Republic. Wonderful place to go. And we did. And I showed all the women where they could buy the wonderful Czech jewelry, little tiny necklaces made of hundreds of garnets, very beautiful and very feminine. And I showed them where they could buy Bohemian glass, so they could get these wonderful wine goblets from crystal in many different colors. So we did many things. I showed them where their revolution in thought was. You know, leave it to the Catholics and Protestants to kill each other. The early Protestant was Jan Hus, and he was burned at the stake in Prague. So we saw everything there was to see, this and that. Prague's a wonderful city, wonderful bridges over a wonderful river. It's the river that if you stay on it and it turns into the German river, it's called the Elbe. What's not to like? That river runs into the Saxon Alps, they're called. There are lots of palaces. Augustus the Strong, and his girlfriend that he kept in one of those palaces. He sold his soul to become king of Poland. But that's another boring story. Anyway, we were doing all of this, seeing all of this, really having a wonderful time. Czech food is wonderful. And then my local guide says, we're going to take you to one of the fortresses built by the great empress herself, Maria Theresa. And I said, oh, that sounds interesting, let's do it. So we went to what's called in German, Theresienstadt. And it turns out that Theresienstadt was the show camp of Nazi death camps. Turned out the word had reached lots of places. Many people didn't believe it, that the Germans would do this. And not all Germans were Nazis, but some Germans were Nazis and some did this. And the word had gotten out so that the International Red Cross demanded to be able to see one of the camps and what was going on. So at Theresienstadt, the Nazis set up a show camp where you could come and you could see students playing a violin, you could see others painting, others taking dance lessons. It was like a big art colony, like something you might see in New York when you go on the Borscht Circuit. It's just very nice, very pleasant. Big sign, work will make you free. So we went there, but now we knew that it was only a show camp. It was only to confuse the West. And the West was easily confused. No one wanted to believe that the people who had given the world Beethoven, Bach, and Brahms would do such horrible things. But they did. So I don't know what else to complete the story for you. There was a plan afoot, many approved of it, of taking, when we took the Italian boot away from Mussolini and got up to above Rome, we captured very large airdromes. And we could have flown in our biggest bombers down to Auschwitz. And the pilots would have been able to get back. The very big thing about pilots, when they take off, they want to know they can land somewhere safely. And they would take off and bomb Auschwitz. Now, in the process, of course, they'd kill all the current people there waiting to be killed anyway, but it would make it impossible to continue to run the death camp. Unfortunately, time took a beating, and it didn't help at all that New York Jews did not raise an early voice. The leading American intellectual Jew of those days was a man named Walter Lippmann. Wrote a wonderful column in a great newspaper, the New York Herald Tribune, the equal of the New York Times, a newspaper that was run by the Whitney family. It's also got their name on a wonderful museum in New York. But Lippmann just refused to believe that the Germany he knew was doing this. And so he was a great denier. He saw that, can you believe he believed that Hitler was an agrarian or a farmer? So with a word like that, you got nowhere. It was a losing proposition. So Auschwitz stayed open to the very end. Buchenwald kept open to the very end. In some cases, in the smaller camps that were near Germany, there was an attempt to destroy the camp before the Allies got there. But the Allies got there anyway. It's a very sad story. One of the greatest musicians of the 20th century was a guy who'd written very powerful operas, Electra, Salome, and the beautiful Rosenkavalier. And when the time came, he always had this really good Jewish librettist who wrote the storyline. And then he was told he should fire that very good librettist because he was Jewish. So Richard Strauss did fire his librettist, coward though he was. Not the librettist, but Strauss. And then as the story goes on, there's actually a Strauss opera written during the war, Capriccio, performed many years later. But when the Americans who went south when they crossed the Rhine and liberated Baden-Württemberg, liberated Bayern, Bavaria, met up with the Soviets. Soviets actually liberated not only Auschwitz, but Berlin itself. General Zhukov took Berlin, cost him a lot. 300,000 Red Army soldiers died because the Berliners fought hand and tooth and nail for every inch of soil they gave up. But back to Richard Strauss for a moment. He went into hiding as the Reich crumbled, as the Gotterdammerung of the Third Reich became a true fallen place. He went into hiding in Bavaria. And when he heard that the Americans were there, had come in to rescue the Bavarians, he came out of hiding, holding on to the hand of his wife, who was Jewish. And he said, don't fire, I'm married to a Jew. It was always fashionable, fascism. It led to the destruction of Germany, the complete and total destruction. When the war was over, we had a very important member of FDR's cabinet. Have I talked too long? Oh, I am going over time. he was Jewish from Chicago. And he suggested to FDR that we make of Germany a complete land of only farmers, that all they will do is grow things. It's sort of like a land with nothing but strudel all over the place. Wasn't practical at all, but and a relative of his wrote a book about that. It became a sensational book that John Kennedy handed to everybody before he was killed. So what can I tell you? Fascism was here in the United States with Huey Long. Don't forget that. Fascism came to Europe early with Mussolini in Italy. Don't forget that. And fascism reached its pinnacle of power with Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. And Adolf Hitler, by the way, was Austrian. He was from Linz, not from Berlin or Hamburg or Frankfurt. The convoluted past, convoluted story. There's more to it, but I don't want to run over my precious hour. So I'll let you go. Thank you very much. Sorry you couldn't be here with me. You had to listen to by Zoom. But we will survive, and we'll go back to the old ways soon. Thank you.